I would like to start by inviting our distinguished members of the panel to come upstairs. Achim Steiner of UNEB, Camilla Tobin of IIED, Julia Marton-Lefebvre of IUCN, and Johan Rockström from the Swedish the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And I'd like to have a round of applause to all of them. Kate Rayworth is also with us, and I hear that Rene Castro is running late because, oh, there he is. He was late but is now arrived. So welcome, Rene. So a round of applause to all of them now. It's my pleasure to give a very short opening for this session. The theme of this session is better footprints and better lives. It's one of the main themes of this IIED conference. And the simple question is how to improve livelihoods while at the same time reducing the ecological footprints. It's not easy. We have 1.5 billion people who are very poor that need to get out of this situation of poverty. We have possibly twice as many, about 3 billion, who are now moving from D and E class to C and D. So now they're buying more goods, which is very good on one hand. But on the other hand, if they follow the same path of North America or Europe, the planet is not going to handle. So the big challenge is how to deal with the issue of increasing livelihoods and at the same time not blowing up the planet. That's it. That's the big challenge. And we are very fortunate that we have, to start this panel, the solutions provided by Camilla. So Camilla will provide us what she calls 3 points as key solutions for this challenge. And she will talk about localizing development, investing in resilience, and using metrics that allow realistic valuation of resources. And with these 3 themes, I think we will have a fantastic discussion with our panelists who will provide their views. These are going to be short presentations, 10 minutes, but then at the end we'll have some time to exchange views and wrap up the discussion. So I'd like to invite you all to welcome Camilla. Thank you.
Well, good morning again, and thank you, Virgilio. Welcome to session 2 of Fair Ideas. This is where we get down to business and talk through how we build a fair, inclusive economy that stays within planetary boundaries. And it's really wonderful, I must say, to be joined by all my kind of star speakers on this panel. As we know, a lot has changed since Rio 92. Income per head's grown by 40%, global population up 1.6 billion, and the number of people in acute poverty is down by almost 500 million. So that's some real progress. But at the same time, as UNEP under Achim Steiner's leadership has shown so clearly, environmental damage has continued to grow, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but pressure on water, land, forests, marine ecosystems, and so on. And looking forward, as Virgilio outlined, all these pressures will multiply if current patterns of demand and economic activity expand at expected rates, pushing us way beyond the safe boundaries for securing life here on Earth, as Johan Rockström and his colleagues have shown us so clearly. IIED's learned a lot since '92, from which we've drawn up a three-point plan, three things which lie at the heart of building a green and fair economy that delivers prosperity for many, not the few. That's localized development, building in resilience, and a realistic valuation of nature's bounty. So first, you need to localize development in multiple and diverse settings. Often sustainable development debates stay at too high a level for people to know what it really means. I could show you 100 examples of sustainability in action drawn from our work with partners around the world. It means getting down to the ground level, securing land, forests, water, and other key assets for local people, recognizing local rights and responsibilities, and supporting neighborhood organizations, as we've seen in the drylands of the Sahel, or the informal settlements in Mumbai or Bangkok, or the forests of Nepal. Local control of natural assets is the surest way to increase investment and generate more sustainable use. Villagers in Niger, on the edge of the Sahara Desert, are protecting their farmland, grazing, and woodlands because they know it's the best way to ensure long-term harvests, fodder supplies for their animals, especially in drought years, and multiple benefits from their woodlands. It comes down to the basic interests and incentives of local people to manage sustainably the resources on which their future livelihoods depend. Low-income neighborhood associations in Zimbabwe, Cambodia, Vietnam are securing their tenure, improving access to water and sanitation, and getting city governments to recognize the strength and energy that can be unleashed by partnering with poor urban communities. It's about building broad-based growth that local people can access. For example, in many forest areas, by investing in locally controlled forests. That way, you support long-term stewardship of forest land, tackle insecure livelihoods, and address forest loss together. So what's the mix? It's securing rights and institutions locally, strengthening market access and infrastructure, and combining new knowledge with local wisdom and priorities. The second thing we have to do is we need to invest in resilience to help people cope with change, both climate and other related shocks. As we approach planetary boundaries, the system becomes increasingly fragile. We've seen this latterly with food prices. Low reserves prompt more volatile market behavior, and as margins tighten and prices rise, it's the poor who suffer most. We've seen this also with climate change impacts. We need finance and other support to build climate-resilient prosperity, and that needs a new kind of plumbing. I looked hard to try and find a good visual for this, and this was the best I could come up with. Instead of one big pipe channeling large quantities of cash, we need lots and lots and lots of small channels that help provide that support in hundreds of thousands of different places. So let's go for new plumbing. This needs the right kind of public policy higher up to promote diverse strategies, strengthen local economic networks, and go for multiple decentralized patterns of production and service delivery. Brazil's social protection programs, Bolsa Familia in particular, show a great model for how to spread growth and opportunity far broader and get children into school and strengthen local economic links. This is a result of a political choice made by government which demands political will. We're helping also make it happen in parts of northern Kenya and western Tanzania, working alongside local government to test out climate resilient measures chosen by local people. The third thing we need to do is to fix the metrics. If you want to manage something, you've got to measure it properly. I don't know how many of you would want to board an aeroplane if you knew that the pilot had a faulty compass and he wasn't sure how much petrol was left in the fuel tank. I certainly wouldn't. And yet this is where we are today. Our global economy is being guided by a very imperfect compass, a very imperfect set of values and instruments, and a pretty hopeless map. As we've seen, this can cause a huge crash and heavy environmental and social costs. Some have argued that putting a price on nature leads to it becoming a commodity to be bought and sold, and that it's safer to keep it unpriced. But in a globalized world, without a price, it faces being undervalued, grabbed, and trashed. So proper valuation of land and forests must be accompanied by recognizing the rights and claims of those who've been living from investing in these resources over generations, as work in Costa Rica has shown so well. So whether we like it or not, numbers count. A lot of our thinking is driven by numbers, and many of our systems operate with numbers at their core. Yet many of the indices on which we depend to measure progress ignore much of what matters to us. Rising GDP tells you your economy is growing, but it says nothing about the sustainability of that growth, nor whether it delivers well-being to most of the population. You can cut down all of your forests, exhaust your water supply, strip your land of its fertile soil, and watch your GDP growth rate rise. But clearly, this makes no economic sense except in the very short term. As IUCN and the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study have shown, putting a price on nature should lead to making better decisions by governments and business. There's nothing immutable about GDP as a number. It's a product of the 1950s, a historical construct. We can leave it behind. We can do better in the 21st century. It's a choice we can make to value what matters to us as a society and design a compass that helps us progress in a better direction. Well, what about the politics of sustainable development? We often ignore the difficult choices and trade-offs to be made and the real conflicts of interest in achieving a transition to a fairer, more stable environment. We can be too naive and always look for win-wins when actually there are some hard choices to make. IIED always seeks to learn from and champion the perspective of less powerful groups within countries and globally. So we've worked with the Least Developed Countries group in the climate negotiations and in preparation for Rio +20. And from discussions with them, there's a keen willingness to explore green economy opportunities if they bring prosperity for their people. Going for low-carbon, resource-efficient growth is fine if it leads to better, more secure incomes, but not if it leads to poor communities being locked in poverty. It's not the consumption patterns of the poor which are pushing us over environmental boundaries. At Rio, we need a grand bargain in which rich countries and rich consumers cut levels of consumption, waste, and inefficiency, while middle and low-income countries construct their economies differently so that they can accommodate the growth and increase in prosperity that's so desperately wanted and needed. I see Rio +20 as the start of a vitally important global conversation around identifying and agreeing sustainable development goals, which build on lessons from the MDGs and generate a common set of aspirations post-2015. Key principles that must underlie them are fair shares within planetary boundaries, as shown so well by Kate Raworth. That means shrinking consumption for some to provide space for others to grow their prosperity. It means accountable government. We vote for them, they spend our money. We need to be better at tracking their performance against their responsibilities. Third, we need long-term plans given the scale of the challenge and the urgency of the plight we face. We will all be losers if we let the future be decided by chance through a mixture of inertia, short-sighted and vested interests. Lastly, whatever happens in the official process, the size of the crowd here and at all the unofficial events gives a powerful message to our leaders. We all recognise the urgent need for change. Working together, locally and globally, we can spur that transition to a greener, fairer economy. There are important choices to be made. We want our governments to make those choices to achieve our collective vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camila, for these very thoughtful remarks to open up the session. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Achim Steiner, my friend Achim Steiner, who is a very appropriate person to discuss the theme of international frameworks and international institutional arrangements to deal with sustainability, because he himself is a multilateral person. He's half Brazilian. The heart is more Brazilian than Austrian, I believe, German. So we don't even care. It's sort of Brazilian. So we like to see Achim's role as a Brazilian at the UN system. But Achim, the key issue for this meeting, as it relates to your participation, is that we would all like to hear from you. What is the institutional arrangement that you envision as being the ideal one for the UN? We all know you're at the center of this discussion. This is one of the two central themes for the Rio conference. And what's your opinion? Maybe you can share with us not only your views, but also how you see this theme developing over the course of the negotiations here and beyond Rio. Achim.
Muito obrigado, Virgílio. É coração de gaúcho e brasileiro. Muito bom dia a todos. And for the sake of being able to reach the larger part of the audience, let me begin by first of all saying that your question about governance is inextricably linked, I think, to the other theme of the conference. And while many see the debate about the green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication as somehow a block of issues over here, and this unfortunate term, institutional framework for sustainable development, which means nothing to a normal human being, what it actually is talking about is governance. And I think this summit, in a strange sort of way, is two things. It's a summit about the world economy. It's a World Economic Summit. But it is also a summit about a new era of governance. And in that sense, the themes are very much connected. Because if you take the balance sheet of the last 20 years or 40 years, and by the way, happy birthday again to IIED, because both our institutions are in midlife crisis mode at 40 years, right?
Life begins at 40.
Absolutely, yes, but we say that, right? No, and I think maybe out of Rio, to the surprise of some, will come more than is currently being expected. not necessarily through final regulatory agreements like we had in '92, conventions and protocols, agendas. But one of the reasons why I'm very grateful to have been invited to join you here is that I do believe if you look into the Rio Centro right now, you get an image of a world that is at a loss of what to do. That is the reality. We have a summit that I would describe like the vortex inside a storm. The Sustainable Development Agenda, 20 years after Rio, has the tempting element of saying, you know, we just have to go back to what we agreed. Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, we said it all in '92, and many of those who said it in '92 are now leading institutions in government, in NGOs, and even in the economy. And they said, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that is absolutely correct. I would sign up to Agenda 21 without one change, really, in its principles today. It remains absolutely the right framework. But to come to a summit 20 years later and looking at, you know, and our report is only one mirror to the world, the GEO5 report, the Global Environment Outlook report, which even to me was surprisingly depressing, I have to say. Because you don't know until a report is finished what the total picture is. And the total picture actually is really one that needs to shake us in our boots. And those of us who work in this field, be it professionally, be it as volunteers, be it in public or private or, you know, non-profit organizations, this is also an indictment of our role in the last 20 years. I mean, we can always blame, you know, the capitalist system or politicians, but, you know, we elect politicians, we buy products, we make the markets in which companies thrive that, you know, have not been part of the solution. We allow governments, you know, every 4 or 5 years to get away with the kinds of policies that we then lament in the reports that we produce. So to me, Rio is also a moment of introspection and reflection in the sustainable development community. And Camilla, what you just laid out as sort of the three-pronged agenda, I think this is the kind of conversation that we need, an honest conversation about the concept isn't wrong, the horizon isn't false, but the strategies are not yet delivering. And I say not yet because this is one of the difficult messages in the year 2012. Beneath a global perspective on sustainable development, which in essence is a failure to turn things around. There is no question about it. We cannot stand in front of the world community today and claim that 20 years after Rio, on virtually any of the major indicators on sustainability, that we have turned the corner. We haven't. But underneath that global meta-level analysis is an extraordinary array of activity, innovation. You just spoke to a number of them. I'm sure my fellow panelists will speak to that in a moment. We have begun to invent that way of bringing about Agenda 21 1 million times across the planet in the last 20 years. But, and I think this is where I come back to the themes of this conference, unless we can also address the fundamental conditions under which our societies, economies, nationally, locally, but also globally function, we will remain pioneers, we will remain laboratories, we will remain the aspirations of what could be done. And that's why I think the themes of this conference, ironically, are extremely timely. Because one of the preoccupations, and you know that this is a piece of work that UNEP has focused on a lot, is that the environmental community has been scared of the economy and of economics for far too long. We define the arena of economic discourse as one that we don't control, that often is controlled by forces that actually do not take sustainability and equity seriously, that expropriate large parts of our communities, whether it is through the kind of land tenure systems, whether it is through the way that markets are dominated by certain economic players. But friends, if we do not go into the heart of the political economy, into the heart of how economic policy is driven, defined, developed and implemented, we will meet here again at Rio Plus 40 if Brazil will host us. And I tell you, we will be even more culpable of not having focused on where real change is needed. That is why I want to appeal to you that, you know, given what a report like Geo5 says, given the realities that Johan, I'm sure, will speak to in a moment about the planetary boundaries. I mean, we are learning every day with better science what, in a sense, we have to manage. And with 9 billion people in a few years' time, few decades' time, we really have to learn to manage much more intelligently, much more cleverly, and much more at the cutting edge of what is feasible and what will lead to tipping points in ecological collapse. And in here, I think the polarity of the debate that postulates, in a sense, the solution to our sustainable development dilemmas in an ideological framework of, it's either the state that will solve everything because the markets are corrupt and business is simply out there to screw the rest of society on the one hand, or the so-called Washington consensus of the 80s and 90s that just let the market solve it because governments are inefficient and supply and demand will take us in terms of resource constraints, etc., into a new level of efficiency. This polarity has paralyzed us for far too long. I remain deeply convinced that this is an ideological luxury that is missing the point, and it goes to the question of governance. Markets are not some God-given formula that functions according to the principles of the laws of gravity in science. Markets are social constructs. Why are we so scared of the notion that, yes, markets are part of the way our world works today? And, for those who use statistics, let us also be pragmatic. Only about 20 to 25% of all economic activity on this planet happens through public budgets today. 3/4 happens in markets. Markets between farmers, market between countries, markets in the global economy. So, should we not try and accept the principle that markets can be governed and that is our agenda of the day? Not to surrender to markets which are not in themselves by some economic science demanding this or that of us. Markets are today often framed by vested interests. That is how policies are developed. That's how subsidies regimes are put in place. That's how a debate about the forest code in Brazil is an excellent example of a raging debate between different interests in a society. And I salute Brazil for the debate it's having right now. It's scary in some ways because it could unravel an extraordinary journey of the last few years, but it is a debate that is now on the table, in the public domain. To close, on 3 brief messages. When we talk about the green economy, many have not really differentiated enough the different concepts. There are some who think the green economy is about markets. Others think it is about greenwashing. To me, it is about the governance by society of the economic arena based on the principles of sustainability and equity. Only then will the green economy be what many would like it to be, which is inclusive, it is fair, it is rooted in basic principles of ecological sustainability. And secondly, also since we are at a global summit here, let me also say the notion that somehow the green economy in its, let's say at least in the way that we have tried to frame it in the discourse of UNEP's Green Economy Report, is not either the prerogative or the privilege of rich and industrialized countries. And for those who are not listening carefully enough, why do you believe that a continent like Africa is in fact extremely interested in the notions of a green economy? Because it is a way of recognizing that if you continue another 20 years to rely on foreign technology and on foreign capital to define your development pathways, then you're going to wait another 20 years for those promises to come. And in Africa, for instance, the green economy discourse is increasingly looking at what is the resource base within our national and social jurisdiction that we can use. And I think extremely important for a summit of the United Nations at this moment is this notion of common but differentiated responsibility. Because what my interpretation of the green economy is that for developed economies, there is a very simple message in this green economy concept. That is essentially your footprint has become too large in a world that has become very crowded. So the green economy agenda for the North is one of reducing footprint. It is reducing consumption, and it is decoupling economic development from the kind of resource throughput and pollution. For developing countries, it is about how to green, let me use that very broad term, the next 10, 20 years of economic development. And yes, also economic growth. I am not scared of that term. I just would like it to be used in a different way. But it is about bringing the kinds of technology opportunities to a developing world that allows, for instance, a continent like Africa or even parts of Latin America to move from the 20th century energy economy, which was pollution, CO2, and technology intense from the global capital markets point of view, to one that would make essentially a jump to renewable energy technology. And that is feasible. That is very feasible, but not with the current economic construct. So, to end, on the governance discussion, and I deliberately chose the logic of why governance is important. It's not about, UNEP or about a Sustainable Development Council. That part of the discussion at the summit, in my mind, is about the world recognizing that if it wants to use multilateralism in the future, it has to also reinvent its institutions. 40 years after founding a sustainable and a UNEP environment program in the UN, surely you have to ask yourself whether the design is still appropriate. And that is why I think most countries now agree that environmental governance, if it is going to work globally, is to be a part of it. The Sustainable Development Council is a recognition of failure. The discussion that is currently ongoing about the Commission on Sustainable Development is one that I think recognizes that that model did not work. But at the end of the day, whether UNEP is upgraded or becomes a specialized agency, or we have a Sustainable Development Council or a forum, let me simply say to you, that is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And the means to an end goes back to the core area of our time. How do we recapture, as societies, as communities, the narrative and the discourse on the economy, which is essentially imprisoning us time and again with arguments that there is only one way of doing this. And that is simply not true, and I hope that will be one of the messages from Rio in 2012. Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. I think you made a number of very interesting points, but I'd just like to pick on one. The issue of the luxury of an ideological debate on markets and government regulations. I think that's a very important one, because oftentimes we get distracted in these debates which miss the key issue which has been highlighted by the GEO5 report, which is the fact that we are really in a very dangerous situation with the planet on many key aspects. So I think that's a very interesting way of phrasing this issue. And that also is a good way of moving to Julia Martin-Lefebvre from IUCN, who has been asked by the organizers of this panel to give her views on what's the role of scientific knowledge and conservation. And you chair IUCN, which is a very well-known and institution with a very long track record. And the question may be, what, sort of following on what Achim said about the institutional frameworks, what is the role of institutions such as IUCN? What has it accomplished? And what it hasn't accomplished, and what could be done differently. Because when we talk about institutional governance, we should not only look at the UN organizations, but rather a multitude of organizations, such as IIED, for example, who is convening this meeting, but especially IUCN. So, what's your views?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. Muito obrigada, Virgilio. So, IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. I know life begins at 40, but life is still pretty meaningful after 60, because IUCN is 64 years old and was formed in 1948, before these issues were so much on the table. And IUCN's founding fathers, I think they were all fathers, had the very interesting idea of having NGOs and governments sitting in the same organization. Many people love to introduce me. Thank you for not doing it, that I head up one of the most complicated organizations in the world. And it is complicated, but the issues are complicated. So bringing all of these stakeholders together in one democratic system, I think has been well worthwhile. Just looking at this panel, IIED is a very important member of IUCN, and it's no surprise to me at all, although we didn't write the paper together, that your action plan and your definition of a fair, sustainable planet where development improves livelihoods and protects the environment at the same time is very consistent with IUCN's 60-plus years vision of a just world that values and conserves nature. One of the things I want to bring to this session is that, knowledge about conservation is not just an esoteric sideshow. It really, nature is our life support. Virgilio, you were one of the founders of the Forest Stewardship Council, which is a member of IUCN. Rene, you represent the government of Costa Rica as Minister of Environment in IUCN. And of course, we have lots of partnerships with Oxfam and with the Stockholm Resilience Center. And Akim, you were my predecessor. I'm just following in your footsteps. And of course, while the UN is not a member of IUCN, although I think it could be, we have very, very close relationships with the UN system as well as with the businesses that are meeting in other parts of this world. So I was asked to talk about the role of science and knowledge in conservation. And I just want to make 4 points in this presentation. First of all, that scientific knowledge today solidly demonstrates that biodiversity loss is a major challenge for survival. Now, why can't we get that information out into the hands of every citizen so we actually do something about it? Johan, you made such a good point in your 2009 paper about planetary boundaries, and you really pointed to the unacceptable trespassing of the system, the most serious overshoot being the loss of biodiversity. And you are not even a full-time member of the conservation community, but you, in your scientific paper, pointed this out very well. I'm sure you'll talk about it, that the losses in biodiversity range between 100 to 1,000 times higher than natural extinction. This is just not acceptable. So scientific assessment have further elaborated this point. I guess the best available scientific overview of the global status of ecosystem services loss was in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which finished its work in 2005, and in which more than 1,300 scientists from all over the world participated. How many of you know about the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment? So, interestingly, quite a lot of our young participants are not raising their hands. Thank you. You raised your hand. That's good. But one of the problems here, and it's a really important scientific assessment, which basically said that humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly and extensively in the last 50 years than in any other previous period. This is really worrying. Now, the problem for me is that the assessment stopped in 2005. We all have the 13 publications on our bookshelves. And really, assessment is not enough. We need to move to action. We need to move from pure science, which is very important. I was here in Rio 20 years ago fighting for that, but also to the applications, to on-the-ground work. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which is the health check on the planet, has pointed out to us the enormous losses in ecosystem services in our closest relatives, the mammals. 22% of them are gone. You'd be very worried if that number of your family members was threatened with survival. But thankfully, not all is doom and gloom. We now have solid evidence that without targeted conservation efforts, and Rene, I hope you'll talk about that. Costa Rica is a great example. The loss of biodiversity as measured by our Red List index would almost be 20% worse. So targeted action, protected areas, legal instruments, and frankly, a different attitude does work. So another one of my messages is that, and we heard that already this morning, that biodiversity conservation, or the conservation of nature, our life support, to put it simply, is not simply a luxurious activity, an esoteric activity of the rich. It's a necessity for the survival of all of humankind. So, of course, what is worrying is that the rate of the loss of biodiversity reduces the resilience, which is one of your 3 action points, Camilla, and the functionality of ecosystems on which all of us depend. So the Millennium Ecosystem the assessment already warned us about this, but we've got to do something more. I think the study on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, TEEB, documented the hidden economic costs that are linked to the ongoing losses of ecosystems. There is nothing wrong, I believe, with putting a value on nature to help us understand it better. We don't have to always pay for everything, but just to understand it. And we've got good instruments in that TEEB report to explain to the economists who we're trying to reach out to that this is very important. So we have increasing evidence of the importance of nature to the world's present poorest communities. More than 1 billion people around the world depend on forest for 1/4 or more of their livelihoods. So this is an extremely important reason why we want to save the forests, not to mention their important role in climate. So of course knowledge, which you asked me to talk about, is a fundamental tool to get us out of our risky past that Akim and Camilla referred to. I think we all know that. It is the greatest tool for human progress. Knowledge has certainly brought us to where we are today. We have accomplished so much. However, knowledge alone will not suffice. We really need leadership, we need wisdom, and we need a determination to work together, not to accept anymore whatever governance system comes out of this UN meeting, not to accept anymore to be pushed in silos to work separately, but to work together. So really what is missing is not knowledge, I believe, but a smart, visionary political leadership with a determination to make the transition happen. I think science has told us a lot. We have a lot of knowledge. I'm not at all suggesting that we shouldn't go on with scientific research, but let's also move into action. So knowledge and science is fundamental, but it is not enough. We need to focus on nature-based solutions instead of searching for technological fixes all the time and big and costly infrastructure to every problem. Nature is our life support system, and it provides us with a huge number of possibilities to address the global challenges that we face in food security, water security, energy security, and the nexus between all of these. So a concrete tool to help us advance in this direction was agreed by 192 countries in Nagoya in 2010 on the CBD strategic plan. And I must say, I was very disappointed in the first outcome document for the Rio conference, luckily that has been changed, that these targets were not even referred to when 192 of the same governments negotiating in Rio Centro agreed in 2010 on these important targets to stop the loss of biodiversity. So we really need an effective mechanism to connect all of this knowledge, all of this determination, and that is, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. So a critical part of this change in governance is needed to focus on enhancing equity. Again, in your paper, Camilla, in our vision of a just world. So equity in the power relations and strengthening the rights and capacities of people who are still marginal in decision making. For example, I don't know if you know that indigenous peoples and poor rural communities have, of course, a generally much lower carbon footprint than the rest of us do, and yet and they depend on the ecosystem. Yet, indigenous peoples who comprise only about 5% of the total population of the planet represent around 15% of the world's poor. This is not acceptable. This is disproportionate inequality. We need policies and institutional frameworks that recognize and support local governance of ecosystems. Again, to one of your three target areas, as well as self-determined development and natural resource management with a strong focus on development, on the devolution of resource management to local peoples. Don't be surprised if you're hearing similar messages from all of us. Now the challenge is to translate this into action. So in conclusion, knowledge drives action, or it should. There is no question that there is even a greater need for up-to-the-minute user-friendly and comprehensive knowledge about biodiversity today that there was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But what we need now is to translate it into concrete, tangible actions that can reverse the dangerous trajectory that we're all on. So investing in nature and a better understanding and valuing and appreciation of nature is a key message of IUCN and all its members here at Rio Plus 20, and we will work hard to ensure that this conference lives up to our collective expectation. Not only the conference that will end next week, but what we're going to do together beyond it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, for very thoughtful remarks. And I'd just like to pick on one thing that you mentioned, the need to have smart and visionary political leadership. And that's much needed. And I think on this issue, one of the big challenges we have is to innovate in policies. And in the previous panel we had, there was an issue of political coherence. There was a question from the floor. And this, I think, is a theme that gives us a good opportunity to invite the next speaker, René Castro, because René comes from a country which is a powerhouse of innovation. Now, Costa Rica has innovated on a number of things and has served as a source of inspirations to many. On a testimonial note, let me just share with you that when Governor Braga was elected and I was appointed Secretary of Environment, one of the first things we did was to visit Costa Rica, and we spent almost a week in Costa Rica. We got a lot of inspirations from Costa Rica, and the payment for environmental services that was implemented in Amazonas was a spin-off of that, was inspired by Costa Rica. So the issue of innovation in public policies, I think, is one that Costa Rica is a very good case and a very good example. Here we have now leaders from these protected areas who are the benefits of these very concrete policies for paying for environmental service. So Rene, the panel organizers or IIED has asked you to talk about the actions that were taken in Costa Rica to pay for environmental services and how those resulted in social benefits and how those also resulted in protecting the environment. So we'd like to learn from you what has worked, what has not worked, what could be done better, and how we can possibly increase the exchange of experiences that you have in Costa Rica with other countries.
Because I need to pass some of them.
Yeah, sure. You can use this, right? If you need to back.
Let's see?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Have a good day. I have to confess that when coming to Brazil, you know, my countrymen, they want us to be a powerhouse also in football, and that's a problem, you know, but we're going to be there. We all did the talk back in 1992, but it's been much harder to do the work. We named this report Tropical Forest, a Motor for Green Growth. It is available there both in English and Spanish, and you can take a CD, so there will be no trees cut for this. But let me start with this. We call this, as you can see, the Costa Rican striptease. How wrong policies almost got rid of all the Costa Rican forest cover. You know, you can see that from the 1940 all the way down from 75% of the land covered by forest to 21% in 1987. Then the Rio Conference came. We all realized that we had to do something and start to change both protection policies, extraction policies, and the course is being reversed. I want to briefly say what we have done, right and wrong, and then what is next. What is after this? The most recent satellite imaginary is this one, 2010. 52.3% of the territory is now covered with forest. It has cost us around $250 million, the whole process. 80% of the money came from Costa Ricans, mainly from fuel tax, and more recently from a user fee to water consumption and use. Initially, what we did was to protect, national parks and wildlife refuge and these kind of things. 25% of the land was protected like that. No take, no touch. But that was unsustainable. And it was mainly state-owned property. So we slowly introduced a scheme like this, and we have been changing from full protection to a larger, multiple use of forest options. For example, in the first row, in the first vertical row, you can see how we protected. But in the last one is how we have combined this now with agroforestry. To combine with cattle ranching, with rice growing and other activities, and also to make sure that farmers will have an extra income to, incentivize them to have more trees, as a more sustainable activity. But I can summarize that we have been through a probably 3 generations process. The first one was mainly tax credits. Then, we realized that we could do better, then did a second generation. But the second generation was still a subsidy. Something coming from the government that is a nice guy and want to be perceived as such. But then the farmers, they said, we don't want a grant, we don't want a gift. We want to do something for that. In that discussion, what is now the Forest Environmental Service payments came to life. So instead of a subsidy, we have to monitor, we have to verify, and we have to report. And the farmers prefer that way. I mean, what is my harvest? They said. I didn't understand their question. Then I realized that in their mind, they produce something, a crop, a service. So they said, well, I'm producing oxygen. This is my service. We have to accept that. We love to think that they fix carbon dioxide, but they prefer to be seen as producing oxygen. So the process came like that, and the third generation was mainly a service, a payment for service. And then I checked some of the common myths around non-extraction policies, which is GDP, poverty rate, and others. As you can see here, that as the forest, which is the yellow line, is upward looking, the Costa Rican GDP is also upward looking. And the poverty rate, is oscillating but downward looking. So there is no correlation of no extraction policies, as we have decided to have, and poverty. And for example, we do also the female participation in the working force. Again, the female participation is outward looking. The forestry is also outward looking, and there is a positive correlation. So there is also a myth, and this is just to make sure. Child mortality, mainly in the rural areas. Child mortality is inverse correlated. It goes down as the forest goes up. And these graphs are good destroy some of the myths surrounding the forest and this process. And quickly, I think we will insist in something like this. Part of the money must come from the CO2 market. You know, the long-term sustainability should be more equitable, not only 80% of the finance coming from Costa Ricans. Perspective for the future, we will need to combine short-term and long-term. We will need some new sources of funding to provide sustainability. We are working ideas like how forest is related with hydroelectric production, how it is to large-scale water uses, how to international and global services, not only domestic services. And then the voluntary markets. You know, these are users of Costa Rican financing services that are willing to, you know, pay some money to preserve the forest. Then we will need to use and rethink how to use the productive forest better now. You know, we have been more concentrated in the protection, and so the use of the productive forest is been dropping. So we need to rethink that, and then how to do the sustainable forest consumption and make the forest environmental service payment, you know, more cost effective. And finally, REDD+. I do a pause here. REDD+ for us will mean to optimize the efforts that countries and regions have done since 1992 to expand, to replicate at the global scale what could be claimed like a success story of these common but differentiated responsibilities. So we see this as an opportunity, and I want to stop with this. We think that the tropical belt of the world, countries like Kenya, Uganda, Congo, northern Brazil, Colombia, Central America, Vietnam, Indonesia, could both benefit their economy, their growth, and could provide global environmental service to the climate. So it's fair that they receive some international payments for this service that they are providing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rene, for a very interesting presentation of a summary of what has been done in Costa Rica. And I'd just like to pick on one issue, the question of policy adaptation, how you shared with us the policy changes over time. So it started with one framework and it eventually evolved. And possibly this is something that can be used as a source of inspiration. Oftentimes we have too many discussions and little action. And I think learning by doing allows us to experiment and improve as time goes by. And this, I think, is also a good way to introduce Kate, who is going to be our next speaker. Kate is from Oxfam, and she's going to focus on the question of how to build a safe space for humanity, talking about the concept of donut and how to get from here to there. So Kate, please.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So I've got an idea that I think could change the world. And it's something that everybody in this room could do. And all you need is a pen. It's a guerrilla campaign that I want to start today. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. Camilla mentioned at the beginning that we need new metrics and that we need a new compass for the journey that we're taking this century. And I agree. And I think the compass we need is in the shape of a donut. And I apologize for bringing junk food into the room. But sometimes you need to get a little bit silly to make everybody wake up and say, what are you talking about with a donut? So I'm going to tell you about the donut. But first I'm going to start 20 years ago. not in Rio 92. I wasn't in Rio 92. I was very busy studying economics at university. And the problem with economics is quite a serious one, because anybody who studies macroeconomics, even just a little bit, will very quickly come into this diagram. It's the diagram of the circular flow of money and goods. And what you see going on is households provide their labor to firms who pay them back money. And with that money, they buy stuff and they get the goods. So the black arrows show the flow of goods and resources, and the red arrows show the flow of money. This is an incredibly simple diagram, but it is at the heart of every macroeconomics textbook. And the big thing about it is it goes right here into the back of the head of everybody who studies economics. So anybody who's a policymaker today working on economics, this went into their head quite a long time ago. And it goes in so subtly that you don't even know it's there. And the problem with it is, it's completely wrong. I'm going to tell you about 3 things that are completely wrong with this picture. The first one is, the economy is not floating on a white page in the middle of nowhere, because it's only looking at, this economy is only looking at monetized resources, right? It's only looking at the flow of resources that get monetized. There's a lot of other resources that really matter to human life that aren't monetized. And the first one that we're all here talking about is the environment. The economy is not floating. It's based in the environment, and there's a flow of natural resources coming into households and pollutants coming out, and same with firms. And we ignore that at our own peril. If you say that to an economics professor, they say, oh, environmental externalities, you can go and do a special paper on that. It's not a special paper, and it's not an externality. It's the fundamental resource on which we depend. So we have to bring it right into the heart of economics, and that's what Akim is trying to do. The second thing that's missing, if the clicker will click, is the unpaid care economy. The extraordinary work that is performed by parents and carers, usually women, providing care for children, looking after sick people, but also this woman has a bucket on her head, because across the world, millions of women spend futile hours of their day carrying water to and from their houses, carrying firewood, growing food that is completely outside the monetized economy. And yet they are providing the fundamental goods and services that keep their families alive day to day. They're massively subsidizing the industrial economy by providing all these things and preparing the workers of next generation. It's completely unaccounted for. If you talk about that, your economics professor will say, ooh, that's feminist economics, that's really strange. We don't have a paper in that yet. But if you ignore this, you are completely ignoring the incredible work of half of the world's population in developing countries. You are ignoring the work of every single person in this room who gets a child up in the morning, looks after them, raises them, gets them to school, and is producing the human capital of the next generation. So we have to bring the unpaid care economy into our understanding of economics. And the third thing that's missing from this diagram is that when firms give payments to households, some people get the wages and they're quite low, and some other people get the dividends, and they've been rather high recently. And the Occupy movement worldwide has pointed out that the inequality that this is resulting in matters, that societies don't want to be extraordinarily unequal. We have to pay attention to, if an economy is growing, how it's growing. If you take all of this away and go back to that picture, it's suddenly incredibly impoverished. And yet that is the picture that economists are putting into their heads. I got really frustrated with economics because of this. And that's why a couple of years ago, I was very, very excited when I saw this. Because to me, this diagram of 9 planetary boundaries done by Johan and his colleagues, what I saw was where economists have refused to put the environment around the economy, the natural scientists have stepped in and done it for you. And they've had a go at quantifying it. So the green area in the middle is the safe operating space on all of those 9 boundaries that we should stay within. And if you take that safe operating space, that might be safe in terms of an environmental ceiling, but we need to bring the story of poverty and human rights in here. So just as there's an environmental ceiling, so too there is a social foundation below which no human should live. Nobody should be in that blue area, because in that blue area, people don't have the resources they need to meet their rights to food, water, energy, incomes. They're living in inequality, ill health. We all have the right to the resources we need in life to meet those rights, but collectively, all 7 billion of us must do it within planetary boundaries. Surely this is the compass that should be guiding us in the 21st century. And it's shaped like a donut. And inclusive and sustainable economic development can only call itself that if it is indeed bringing us into this space. Just as Johan tried to plot where are we on the planetary boundaries, I decided to do the reverse on the social boundaries. And for all the metrics that I could find, all the dimensions for which I could find data, we are under the boundary. So 13% of people in the world don't have enough food to eat. 19% of people live without access to electricity. 21% of people are living on less than $1.25 a day. Humanity is falling far below the boundary. And when you put the social floor next to the planetary boundaries, this is the crisis we face. Millions of people still live below the social foundation, and we've already gone over the planetary boundaries. It's a sign of just how extraordinarily unequal this world is, and how unequal the path of development we've been taking has taken us on this journey. So we need to get rid of it. We need to really bring this into the heart of the way we think. This needs to influence economics. So here's my guerrilla campaign. Everybody could just get their pen. Oh, I have to say, this is not Oxfam policy, just before I get in trouble. If you've got your pen, you sneak into the university library, you sneak into the bookshops, you sneak into the room of every economics professor you know, and you take your pen and you draw in the environment around this diagram. You draw in the unpaid economy, and you draw in social inequality. Now just think what a favour you're doing to all those economic students, the 16-year-olds and the 18-year-olds who are just about to start studying economics. Because for everything that Akim is doing, everything that Johan's done, all the work on the natural capital and bringing it into the economy, this diagram is still what economic students will meet today. And it's going to get put right into the back of their heads. We have to change the fundamental paradigm of what we think the economy is if we're going to change the way we think the world should be run. If you're willing to go one step further, you could even rip that page right out of the book and stick this one in instead. Now imagine, you're here on the first day of an economics course. Welcome to economics. You want to be an economist? Fantastic. Let's not talk about money yet. Before we get there, there's a few things you should know about this planet. That it has planetary boundaries. You need to know a little bit of science first. And you should know something about its inhabitants. They have human rights. And it takes resources to realize those rights. Now, with that knowledge, your job as an economist is so important. Your job is to design markets and regulation and governance to bring us into that space between social and planetary boundaries. Now, if that's the way economics started, I would be proud to call myself an economist. It's the way we need to go. If you're interested in this idea, we've got a panel session on it first thing tomorrow morning, really dynamic panel who are going to discuss whether or not we can put planetary and social boundaries into action. I'm blogging about it for Oxfam. There's the blog address. I'm talking about it on Twitter. So if you're into living in the donut, please join me there. Thank you.